Welcome to A Wild New Work. This is a place where we listen to the land, to the ancestors, and to the wisdom that still resides within us so that we can bring an old and sturdy strength into the present moment. I'm Megan Leatherman, and I'm your host today. Hi, friend, and welcome back. I hope you're looking forward to today's installment of Peasant Summer on Wild Waters. May this be a source of real hydration for you in this dry part of the year. This is the last of 3 episodes of Peasant Summer that I'm sharing publicly, but if you would like to listen to the entire series of 8, which includes episodes on peasant food and how people grew their food and what they ate and what it meant to be sustained by a much wider web of nourishment. Other episodes include ones on edge walking and what it was like for peasants living in a time when the edges between this world and the next were much blurrier, and when there were spirits of all kinds, and also when there were still members of the community who were revered for their edge walking skill and craft. There are other episodes on the spirit of home and spinning and weaving and the harvest, and all of that is ready for you anytime in Eagle Creek, and you can learn more at awildnewwork.com/eagle-creek. I will be engaging in more of this kind of work this autumn. I'm teaching a class called Ancestor Speak on September 16th and on October 6th, and you're welcome to join me in one of those sessions if you have longed to hear from your ancestors or want to strengthen your channel of communication with them. I will also be holding 2 bigger containers this fall called Meant for More, which is a vocational guidance small group for those who are ready to make meaningful change in their working life and walk that edge between spiritual calling and material needs. And I'll also be teaching another series of Weaving with the Ancestors for those who are ready to bring and experience the healing of one of their family lines and do that much deeper work of ancestral reclamation and weaving. So you can learn all about each of those containers at awildnewwork.com. Peasant Summer was such a beautiful experience for me, and I'm not sure exactly where it will take us or what is coming next for the podcast this autumn, but I think it will be more along this vein, either more exploration of what life was like for peasants and what we can pull forward. There are lots of areas of peasant life that we didn't cover in Peasant Summer. Perhaps the peasant experience of the autumn might be appropriate. There's themes around slaughter and harvest, death practices, Samhain rituals, all kinds of rich areas that we could journey into together. So I'm curious about that and chewing on that. I'm also interested in exploring the process of converting the peasantry from paganism and animist beliefs into Christianity and what that was like and what that has to teach us about empire and domination today. So there are a few threads I'm pulling on and spinning and considering, and whatever comes together, I hope you'll be there with me this autumn when the next episode is published. I anticipate that being sometime around the autumn equinox in late September. But wherever we go, I'm so grateful to be on this path with you. I hope that this show and these 3 episodes have been deeply nourishing. Please reach out anytime with questions or reflections. And if you have enjoyed this mini series on Peasant Summer, I'd be so grateful if you shared it with your beloveds and community. And until we meet again, take such good care. I will see you on the other side. Hello, friend, and welcome back to Peasant Summer. Here we are in week 3 to talk about wild waters. medieval conceptions of and relationships to water, this most sacred element that we need very much in the summer. And this is also timed intentionally because as this comes out, the sun will be in the sign of Cancer, which is an important water sign that ushers us into the summer season right after the summer solstice in late June. So today we're going to talk about spiritual ideas and cosmologies about water, this time for these peoples. We'll also talk about sort of daily utility of water and how people in the peasant class during the Middle Ages used and benefited from water and what their experience has to teach us right now, living today in the summer season when we too need water very much. And before I dive in today, I want to say a couple things about Christianization in Europe among the peasantry at this time, because I think it will make what I share today a lot more coherent or make it make sense. So by the Middle Ages, by the year 476 or 500 or so, when the Middle Ages technically begin, Christianity has traveled and is rooting in throughout the area that we are discussing, throughout the area of Western Europe where the Roman Empire was once established. So at this time, by, kind of the early Middle Ages, but definitely into the mid and late Middle Ages, the church has become very well established as a presence in the lands, but also as a dominant force in political situations and as a source of power for those already in power. And many customs and beliefs among the peasantry were openly attacked through the process of Christianization and or appropriated. So old traditions became Christian traditions through, rewriting the story or saying that, this isn't sacred water, this is something else, or we've conquered the spirit of this lake. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So it's really important to understand that this dynamic was at play all throughout the period that we're talking about, where this new religion is coming in, this new religion that has been formally adopted by the Roman Empire hundreds of years ago and is a religion of power. And this religion was adopted and utilized by those in power to perpetuate their power. And also, there were people at this time of all classes who did really resonate with this new religion or this new God or these new stories. And I don't want to pretend that that wasn't happening, but a lot of what I have read or looked into in terms of how Christianity came into these places was that they do generally seem to be histories of domination and oppression and forced assimilation among especially the peasant class. So the headline is In the Middle Ages, the church is well established. It's a channel of power. It became a kind of mandatory belief system among people of all classes, and that never meant that old traditions and pagan beliefs were completely uprooted, but we kind of have to search for them inside of writings from the clergy or inside of traditions and folk histories. And again, there were people who chose to convert to Christianity and embraced that religion, and it wasn't all bad. Parts of Christianity were really, really bad for women, especially in this time, or people who didn't fit into the church's kind of patriarchal order. And in some ways, Christianity brought freedom to some women, like noble women who chose to join a convent and engage in learning and opportunities that may not have previously been available to them. So it's a complicated history, but in general, what I would like to do inside of Peasant Summer is pull out and uplift older pagan customs and traditions that at this point were being attacked, appropriated, or changed to fit the Christian narrative. And one of those customs or traditions or cosmologies was different Germanic, Norse, Celtic, and many, many in between, all across Europe, all across the world, many different stories of the world tree. A lot of cultures around the world across time carry this story or this belief in a world tree that is kind of the axis of our world and gateway into other worlds, and that this living tree is what keeps our world intact, and that this tree is fed by sacred waters. And this cosmology is one that we find in the Germanic and Norse traditions as well. And in those traditions, the world tree is called Yggdrasil. And Yggdrasil is inhabited by many different kinds of creatures. And again, it's kind of the axis upon which all of the worlds dwell, including Midgard, our world, the middle world. And the Fates, or the Norns, the three spinners, exist at the base of Yggdrasil, and they sit at what's called Urd's Well. And I want to read you a little excerpt from an Icelandic writing called the Völuspá from about 1100. And these two stanzas introduce us to Yggdrasil and the Norns and the well at the base of this world tree. And I should say that in this tradition, Yggdrasil is an ash tree. That's the type of tree that the world tree is. So the author writes, quote, "There stands an ash I know, called Yggdrasil, a mighty tree moist with shining drops. From it come dews that fall adown. It stands green over Urd's well. Thence come the all-knowing maidens, three in the hall under the tree. Urd is one called, another Verdandi. They scored on the wood, and Skuld the third. They lay down laws, they allot life for humankind's children, speaking fates." So the legend is that the three fates or the three Norns are writing runes onto the wood of Yggdrasil, and they are spinning the fates of every person born alive, and that they tend the well, Urd's well. And the three fates are named Urd, which means became or what was, Verdandi, which is the becoming, and Skuld, which is what will be. And so the well, and I'll quote Max Dashew here from her book, Witches and Pagans. And in this quote, she is also partially quoting a writer named Carl Blind. So Max Dashew writes, quote, "The well is named Urðarbrunni, after the eldest maiden Urd. Her well is a reservoir of ancient being, fed by a living spring. Its surface ripples and roils with power and consciousness. Within it resides, quote, the unfathomable secret of the beginnings of life, deeply hidden," end quote. So with these waters from this primordial well, the Norns make clay to seal and nurture the roots of Yggdrasil, keeping the tree well and healthy. So I don't know how many peasants by the time we get to the Middle Ages still actively practiced a belief in cosmologies such as this, indigenous cosmologies about world trees and the fates and the spinners and destiny. But I think it's safe to say that even if there weren't so many people actively practicing these, because by the time we get to the Middle Ages, it has become somewhat unsafe to do so with Christianization coming to the fore. But even if people weren't actively practicing, let's say actively making offerings to the fates or, making prayers when a baby was born or visiting ash trees and making offerings, if that wasn't occurring, I still believe, even as it does today, that this knowing, this way of relating to the world, this knowing that something was woven together, that there is a primordial well or beingness that exists, that the world is alive and growing and multifaceted, that those cosmologies would have lived inside of these peoples in the Middle Ages. And I believe it's safe to say that, on one hand, because many of these stories did survive. People continue to hold on to these and practice these beliefs. We have archaeological and written evidence that people were still practicing some of these customs into the Middle Ages and beyond. There were people who kept these ideas and beliefs alive. And even if they weren't explicitly doing so, there's so much folklore around wells, sacred waters, sacred trees, that even if we're not sure what cosmology those fit into, or, was it a Christian practice by that point, something lives inside of humans that continues to take us into or yearning for a relationship to sacred waters and the webs of weird or destiny that we feel ourselves woven into or into sacred relationships with sacred trees who are the embodiment of an axis that we're spinning on. So some of this is beyond what's even in the written language or in history, and I think it's just become a part of our bodies and DNA at this point. And I think it would have been even more so, more pronounced for the peasants living in the Middle Ages at this time. So we have old place-based cosmologies and ideas like the one I just mentioned about Yggdrasil and Urd's well. And then we have more maybe local or tangible or on a smaller scale, lots of different examples from this period of how people would relate to water and the spirits of water and mythology and stories around water and people's relationship to water as one that was sacred. So there is lots and lots of evidence that many people believed that waters, whether it's streams, creeks, lakes, ponds, bogs, rivers, that waters were protected by and inhabited by fairies, especially that fairies often carried a particularly aquatic nature to them or resonance. There are stories about, the Lady of the Lake or other beings, helpful or unhelpful, who live inside of the lake. There's legends of Scottish kelpies, horses, water horses who take shape and move through the element of water. So bodies of water were thought to be protected by or tended to by otherworldly guardians and caretakers who needed to be acknowledged, respected, and sometimes appeased. And these beings could be very helpful if they were approached thoughtfully, and sometimes they could be scary or very unhelpful. And oftentimes, when I read about scary ones, there seems to be this lesson around balance and keeping humans in check and ensuring that this sacred relationship between people and the land or people and the waters is honored rather than it being just about a monster that is out to, hurt people. And there's one old story about this relationship and what happens when sacred waters and guardian spirits are violated. And I want to share it with you today. And this comes out of the Arthurian Grail stories. There are many stories from the Middle Ages about King Arthur, and they were written down in the 12th or 13th century, but these are much older stories. They've been mentioned in the ninth century writings, but it sounds like these were stories that lived in oral tradition before that. And one of the first stories that was written in the King Arthur cycle is a story called Percival, which is about the Grail story, which is this story about a fisher king who has a wound that cannot be healed, and his land is a wasteland. And until the king's wound is healed, the land's wounding cannot be healed either. And in the original stories, the land is a wasteland because of that king's wound. But then there's this kind of obscure text that was written as a prologue to Percival called The Elucidation, which was written in the 13th century by an anonymous source after Percival was written, and again designed as a prologue to that text. And this text claims that the land in the Grail stories was a wasteland because the tenders of the water, the well maidens, had been violated. So it's the disruption of the relationship between people and the guardians of the water that caused the land to become barren. And I want to read you the excerpt from the elucidation that talks about how this happened and what happened, but it does include a story about rape. It doesn't go into detail, but it does name that. And so if you want to skip ahead a minute or so, you definitely can. So this is called the Maidens of the Wells. And again, this is from the elucidation from the 13th century. The kingdom went to ruin. The land was so dead and desolate that it wasn't worth two bits. They lost the voices of the wells and the maidens who dwelled in them. Indeed, the maidens served a very important purpose. No one who wandered the highways, whether at night or in the morning, ever needed to alter his route in order to find food or drink. He had only go to one of the wells. He could ask for nothing in the way of fine and pleasing food that he would not have forthwith, provided he asked reasonably. At once a damsel would come forth from the well, as I understand. Travelers could not have asked for one more beautiful. In her hand she'd be bearing a golden cup with bacon, meat pies, and bread. Another maiden would come carrying a white towel and a gold and silver platter, in which was the food that had been requested by the man who'd come to be fed. He was warmly received at the well, and if this food did not please him, she would bring a number of others, joyfully and generously, according to his desires. One and all, the maidens happily and properly served all those who wandered the highways and came to the wells for food. King Amangan was the first to violate their hospitality. He behaved wickedly and underhandedly. Afterwards, many others did likewise. Because of the example given by the king, who should have protected the maidens and guarded and kept them safe, he forced himself upon one of the maidens and deflowered her against her will, and took the golden bowl from her and carried it off along with the girl, then had her serve him ever afterwards. Ill luck was to come of it, for no maiden served again or came forth from that well to help any man who happened by and requested sustenance there. And all other travelers followed the king's example. God, why didn't the other vassals act according to their honor? When they saw that their lord was raping the maidens because of their beauty, they likewise raped them and carried off the golden bowls. Never afterwards did any maiden serve or come forth from any of the wells. Know that this is the truth. My lords, in this way the land went into decline, and the king who had so wronged them and those who'd followed his example all met a dreadful end. The land was so wasted that no tree ever bloomed there again. The grasses and flowers withered, and the streams dried up. Afterwards, no one could locate the court of the rich fisher, which had made the land resplendent with gold and silver, splendid furs, precious brocaded silks, fine foodstuffs and cloth, gerfalcons and merlins, goshawks, sparrowhawks, and falcons. In earlier days, when the court could be found, there was throughout the land such an abundance of riches, of all those I've named here, that everyone, rich or poor, was awestruck at the wealth. But now it has lost everything. Now, you might have been listening to that and, like me, felt like there was already some problematic parts to this text before we got to the violation, which is, this language around these maidens just being, young and perky and beautiful and so happy to serve anyone, especially men wandering by. And definitely there's some problematic patriarchal undertones to this, but I wonder if it's speaking to an older understanding of the abundance of the earth and how much humans are blessed by the earth, and that, the earth is generous without asking for payment, but demanding respect. And that when that relationship is dishonored, when something is taken against its will, then the land reacts accordingly and becomes barren, and the giftedness falls away. So even in the midst of 13th century patriarchy and Christianization, I think there was still this understanding and actual practices, especially among the peasants, among pagan people out in the heath, out farther from the towns and the areas being converted to Christianity, that people there still understood that water and the spirits of the waters were sacred, and that the mistreatment of those guardians, the mistreatment of the land and the waters would lead to waste and barrenness and imbalance. And I think some people at this time could see that this was what patriarchy and Christianity was offering, and some people could not see that. And there are stories of clergy essentially conquering sacred wells in a different way, but with the same undertones of violation and taking and ending the people's sacred relationships to the land. And I want to share one such example of this from something called The Life of Saint Patrick. And Saint Patrick was a Christian missionary and eventually a bishop in 5th century Ireland. And this is a summary that Claude Lecoteau has written in his book, Demons and Spirits of the Land. And so this is his summary of a story about St. Patrick from that text, The Life of St. Patrick. I hope that's not too confusing. So this is the story, quote, "Two young women, Ethna the fair and Fedelm the red rose, went to a fountain to draw water in Rathcrogan. St. Patrick conversed with them and gave them such a convincing lesson of catechism that they converted. They received the Eucharist and died forthwith, and were then buried near the fountain." So this is a story written to support St. Patrick's work and support the narrative of Christianity, that Christianity has the power to destroy the goddesses of the water, the guardians of water, the sanctified relationship between the people and sacred waters or the source of life. And there are many stories of this happening, of Christianity conquering the spirits of water or sacred spirits of, the trees or the grove or forest or whatever body of land it may be. Even in spite of the harm that was going on toward these sacred waters at this time, whether through patriarchal violation and domination and conquering of the land and or through Christianization, there were still very persistent traditions among the people of going to healing waters, of praying to the water spirits, to the fairies, of making offerings, of believing in, Selkies and Kelpies and other mythological or real beings of the waters. And I want to read you another excerpt also from Witches and Pagans, Max Dashu's book. And this is from the Gesta Herwardus Saxonis from 1068. I know, I'm sure, I'm butchering many of the names and terms that I'm sharing today. But in this writing, there's a description of English or Anglo-Saxon women who are holding nighttime dialogues with the spirit guardian of a spring. And so here's a quote from that manuscript. Quote, "In the middle of the night, the women go out in silence to the springs of east-flowing waters. Hereward saw them go out of the house beside the garden, and he immediately followed them and heard them from a distance, conversing with I know not what guardian of the spring, asking questions and waiting for answers." Okay, so a lot of the evidence we have that these practices were ongoing among the peoples is writings from the clergy who are trying to make sense of them or decrying them or making sure people know that it's sinful. And one example of that is a writing from Burchard of Worms, who wrote, quote, "Hast thou come to any other place to pray other than a church or other religious place which thy bishop or thy priest showed thee? That is, either to springs or to stones or to trees or to crossroads, and there, in reverence for the place, lighted a candle or a torch, or carried there bread or any offering, or eaten there, or sought there any healing of body or mind?" Okay, so that's a very long-winded question, and he's asking confessors, so people in the church who play this role of being confessors, like receiving confessions from the people. He's asking, have you engaged in any of these pagan practices? Have you gone to springs or stones or trees or crossroads and gone in reverence? Have you gone and lit a candle or taken bread or any offering, or have you eaten there or sought any healing there? Because if you have, it's a problem. And I'll just share one more excerpt from this section of Dashu's book. She wrote, quote, "Meditation by the waters was a very old custom. The 8th century penitential of Egbert of York not only forbade making libations and other offerings at wells, but also the custom of sitting out beside a spring. He wrote, if any has waked at a well, or if anyone keeps night watches by rapids, it's a problem." So the clergy would not be writing about these things if they were not occurring. And I think there's a lot of really beautiful evidence that people were all throughout the Middle Ages and beyond returning to the waters for healing, for solace, for kinship. And women especially held that relationship very closely in really real ways. And one article I read that I'll link to in this post writes about how women were thought to be watery beings, that water was kind of a primary element in women's bodies based on Greek systems around the four humors, and that the blood waters that flowed from their bodies through menstruation made them impure, and that that sort of mysterious process was thought, especially by the church, to be yucky, and a woman shouldn't be in the church if she is bleeding. And on the other hand, there were many female Christian mystics at this time who believed that their tears, the waters that came from their bodies through great emotion and devotion to Christ, that their tears were a direct offering to Christ, and that to be a true mystic, a female mystic at this time, meant to display great displays of weeping and emotion. And there's a really interesting story about one of these mystics in the book Femina by Janina Ramirez, which is also in our bibliography. But there were lots of women at this time kind of traveling and making a name for themselves as mystics, and emotion and tears and, the use of water in their bodies in that way was somewhat revered. And finally, water in the village was often women's work, collecting the water, cleaning the water, using the water. And I want to talk now about the utility of water in the peasant village. So before we get into like laundry and washing and drinking water in the peasant village, I will say that there were for sure some problems. Again, settled life, agricultural life in which humans are in one place for the most part, that in general breeds stagnation and pests and disease. And there is this narrative when you're looking into medieval history, this idea that these people were dumb, that they would just, absent-mindedly drink from polluted waters or not understand how hygiene worked. There are these narratives that these people were incredibly dirty, that they wanted to be dirty, that they were totally uncivilized. And it's a really elitist look at the people living in this time, that just because they didn't have, the same systems, or that they maybe were not literate, that meant that they were at peace being unclean, that they were unclean, that their very lifestyle, their very beingness was dirty or disgusting. And of course, especially in medieval towns, it was nasty at times. But it's not true that everyone living as peasants in the Middle Ages did not know how to be clean or did not want to be clean. If you think about, like, if you go camping, and if you think about living kind of as a camper your entire life without indoor plumbing, it is different. Your level of cleanliness or the way you relate to that is different, but it doesn't mean that we want to be uncomfortable and dirty and, sitting in muck or in our own waste. So here we are still in settled life today, living in our towns and cities, and we're not nomadic, we're not hunter-gatherers today, but we've kind of believed that we have conquered settled life. Like now we have indoor plumbing and showers and washing machines, and we're so hygienic, but it's kind of like at what cost? And I think there are really beautiful things about how peasants from the Middle Ages used or did not use water at this time. So, first, I want to talk about drinking water. People in villages in the Middle Ages would have had wells that were dug down to access water from underground, fresh, clean water that they would pull up and use for drinking water or washing or cleaning clothes. They may have also gotten water from a stream that was thought to be clean, or they may have filtered it themselves. People were aware of animal waste in rivers and ways that water could be polluted. I'm sure there were troubling stories of people's, waste, their human waste, accidentally mixing with the well water or the living water that people drank from and people getting sick from that. But again, to believe that people were just completely stupid and drinking water right next to their waste, I think that's just not likely. So people did make sure to have access to clean drinking water. And often people would have to carry that water to their homes, which is heavy work. Water, of course, was also used to wash clothes. And so many people living in the medieval period had linen clothes, and linen, especially made from flax, linen is very durable and not as likely to get nasty as cotton is. So people would wear something linen right on their bodies, like as their undergarments, and then maybe wool or another textile over, so that the linen undergarments generally would stay fairly fresh for a few days at least, and then those could be kind of cleaned, either spot cleaning or a wash at home. And then you could spot clean, wool or silk as needed. Not that peasants had silk, but wool perhaps, especially in the colder times, a wool cloak or wool outer layer. And then people in medieval villages would engage in what one person called the Great Wash, which could be, I heard, either, maybe weekly or every several weeks. And this was often a communal undertaking in which all the linens of the household would be bleached and thoroughly washed. And it was a big undertaking. So you would gather all your linens and you would have something like lye, which could be, water gone through wood ash that would create a cleaning agent called lye. You could also use a plant called soapwort to create kind of soapy bubbles and help to clean. And you would take your linens to a body of water, either like great big tubs that have been filled by the well, or to, the river or the pond, not the pond probably, but the river or the stream. And in some places, you would, and I don't know if this was universal, but there's evidence that people would pre-treat their linens to make them white again. And one of the techniques for doing this was to use stale urine, which sounds disgusting. But there are cases where people would empty their chamber pots into a barrel of urine over the week and then use that urine to pre-treat their clothing because the ammonia in the urine would bleach their linen, and then they would wash it and essentially beat out the dirt and the grime on a rock or, in the river, in the stream. So water was used regularly to wash clothes and help people stay clean and fresh in their clothing. And that was important because people in the peasantry would have had maybe one outfit at a time, perhaps two, but there were not a lot of clothing items around, so you had to take good care and wash what you did have. And people, of course, would also need to wash their bodies. So perhaps that was washing with cold water, a little sponge bath in the morning, or washing your face or your hands. There may be, once a week, like a chance to be washed in warm water or hot water that's been heated, again, in like a little vessel or a barrel in your home. But this would have been water that was shared by everyone in the home. So if you didn't get the first bath, that could get kind of nasty. And then, of course, people would also wash in wild waters, in the rivers, in the streams, in the lakes, and stay clean that way. But of course, pests, lice, those were definitely a thing. There's, plenty of combs, lice combs from this time period that show us that, things were not perfect or completely pest free. And finally, in terms of how peasants would have related to water, waters could have also been a source of food for these peoples. The fish that swam in the rivers may have been able to be caught, especially if peasants lived by the sea. Mussels and other sources of food from the sea, seaweed, may have been harvested and part of their diet. So, water was an absolutely essential part of the peasant lifestyle and village. And in the summer, especially, water was necessary to irrigate and hydrate the crops that these peoples are dependent upon, and also necessary for healing and renewing, getting cool, and then continuing to cleanse their bodies and their clothes all throughout the summer and the year. And the same is true for us today. We also need water to hydrate ourselves, wash our bodies, wash our clothes, and renew our spirits. Summer is the season of fire. So it's when the element of fire bears down on us from the sun and teaches us about our relationship to all that fire entails: transformation, heat, burnout, the generosity of warmth and light. And in that season, we really, really need water in order to keep things balanced. Just like in the season of winter, which is the season of water, we really need fire to keep things balanced. We need warmth and light at the darkest time to keep water kind of in balance in our own experience. So, in the season of summer, in the season of fire, we are absolutely learning, each individually and collectively, what it is like to overheat, for things to become desert. We're learning about the consequences of living inside a culture that has disrespected and violated and harmed its sacred waters and the guardians of those waters. A lot of people are learning about burnout, when your fire has gone out, when it feels like there is no flame, no vitality in the body anymore, in which case often more fire is needed. We need to go out and feel the shining light of someone else's heart on our heart. We need to feel seen and connected to. We need to go sit beneath the sun or watch the sunrise or the sunset and feel the generosity of that warmth and light on our own bodies, helping us to awaken again and be reignited in a healthy way. So, as we are experiencing fire, and there's nothing you need to do to experience fire this summer, it just is all around. What we need is often to be really smart about our sources of renewal and how to tap into water to stay well and to dance with the fire in a good way this season. So, I want to talk a little bit about some of what we've covered today and how to pull it into your life this season. And the first is Urd's well, that primordial well of life, that well of waters from which all things arise and return. It is the source of our beingness. And your soul knows how to take you to Urd's well because it's where you came from and it's where you'll return. And maybe your ancestors didn't call it that, but I bet they had another name for this idea, this not just idea, but this fact of life. And we can access Urd's well by listening to our soul, by attuning to the soul, by following our soulful yearnings and turning inward. Water's direction is inward, and fire's direction is outward. So we can make time this summer to go into the well inside of us through meditation, trance, flow states, whatever it is that gets you into that internal watery place again. And when we're cut off from that, when we don't have regular touch points in which we're turning inward and feeling that hydration, feeling that well inside of us and at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree, we get very, very dry. We become desertified, and the fire all around us becomes too hot. And so let your soul lead you to the waters regularly this summer. We can also, in this time period of summer when so many of us are out and exploring the land or being with the land, we can engage with the spirits of water, the guardians of water. And this is work that I did a little bit this spring. There's a podcast episode, number 167, on old land spirits, where I talk about the guardians of the land. And then there's a bonus recording here in Eagle Creek from May 4th about this as well. And I didn't talk about water guardians specifically in those recordings, but this is absolutely something that you can experiment with or explore this summer, where you go to a body of water and you play around with the idea that this body of water may be inspirited, that there may be a spirit to this place. There may be guardian spirits looking over this body of water. You may see if you can feel an energy around this water. You could take an offering or just speak aloud your acknowledgement that they may still be there. I find that offering water, more clean or blessed water, is really welcome. Water likes to find water and assimilate with itself. So, bringing water to water is often a really nice offering and a blessing. And you can also invoke the help of these guardian spirits to help purify and cleanse polluted waters. So much of the waters that we're visiting have been abused and are polluted. And many guardian spirits, I think, are waiting for or appreciate human invocation of their help and power to purify these waters again. You can go to waters, you can make a pilgrimage to, let's say, the headwaters of a river or the headwaters of a stream that you love, or go to a special lake and make a pilgrimage. And maybe you arrive at dawn or you come in a special ceremonial way, and you can ask for their guidance for your own life. You can ask to be hydrated and renewed at a deep level. You could, with permission or after asking, bottle some of their water to take for healing and use it in ritual. There are many ways to be in dialogue with these sacred waters, even in our modern situations and climates and ecosystems. And that work of re-engaging in an old way, I think, is really, really important. And I want to share another quote from Demons and Spirits of the Land by Claude Lecoteau. And he writes, "The world has been explored and explained and stripped of its poetry. Alas, people no longer gain control of their property through intimidating rites. They purchase it in the presence of a notary. People no longer go to the fairy fountain. They turn on a faucet. Fortunately, the spirits survive, and they emerge from the shadows every time a writer goes back to our roots and does not hesitate to draw inspiration from local beliefs or books from the past. These writers perform a good deed by passing on to us and our children the memory of a bygone world in which spirits were inseparable from humans." So I don't believe that you have to be a writer to do this work. I believe every time you go and pull on these threads or invoke these spirits or acknowledge that there is spirit in this world, that you are reweaving something very, very important and allowing more of water's power and renewal to come into this thirsty, thirsty world. So we've talked about Urdswell. We've talked about engaging with the spirits of water, the guardian spirits of water. And now I want to talk about water work as ritual. So this summer, you could hand wash some of your clothing, probably not in fermented urine, although if you do that, please let me know how it goes. But you could hand wash your clothing in a ritualized way. If there's something, some important event coming up, or a birthday, or something meaningful, or you just want to feel renewed, you could hand wash your clothing in blessed water or in a stream and hang it out to dry in the sun. Your washing of your body could be done in a ritualized way, where again, you're seeing it as a ceremony that you're cleansing your body, your aura, and everything that's been put to use from the day before or the days before goes down into the drain or down the river to be composted, and that you come out free and cleansed. If it rains this summer, that's a very special thing, and you could put out bowls to collect rainwater and use that rainwater as a sacred offering to the land or to the waters later this summer or later in the year. Your own hydration could become a ritual. So you could invoke or imbue your drinking water with the power of Urd's well, with the power of the sacred wells that nurture our world trees, whatever cosmology you're engaging with. You could put special herbs in your water so that as you're drinking your water all day, you are also receiving the benefits of, you know, mint or mugwort or lemon balm or whatever you have on hand. If you don't have access to wild spring water to drink, which is a rare thing nowadays, unfortunately, but I do encourage you to consider or look into whether or not there are wild waters in your area that are safe to drink. But if you don't have access to that and all you have is tap water, a practice I like to do sometimes is to put it in a big glass jar and leave the lid off and let the chlorine and other things in the water just gas off, like become gas, and let the sun kind of purify or strengthen that water and then bring it inside and drink it after maybe a couple of hours. So, your drinking water, your hydration can be a ritual and be done in an intentional way if that feels good. And finally, I want to encourage you, strongly encourage you, if it feels safe and fun, to swim in wild waters this summer. Not enough people are having whole body experiences of being inside a body of water. And I know that's not available to everyone, but if there is a way for you to even place your feet inside of a current or a stream, place your whole body, or even sprinkle the water from a living body of water onto you, there's something very old and sacred about that, that all of your ancestors knew, no matter where they were from. But there's real importance in feeling with your body the rush of a current, feeling yourself buoyant and held in the water, feeling afraid of what might lie in the depths and swimming with that fear, letting the waters, those wild waters, into our skin, informing us and giving us different sensations and knowings that we may not have had otherwise. So I hope the water that you are already engaging in or that you're planning to go to this summer can be related to as the source of life and renewal that it is this season, and that you feel emboldened or enlivened by the memory, the remembrance that this is a relationship that humans have had forever since humans evolved, and that our look into the Middle Ages today is just one example of how sacred and long-standing this relationship is, and how our relationship to water is a place where real meaning and depth and healing can occur, both personally and collectively. So I know I've given you lots of ideas with which to work with this material already in this episode, and I encourage you to do anything that just feels nice and easy and fun. And I want to pull out one activity specifically, which really helps me in the summer season. I want to invite you to put a couple of Urd's wells in your home. And all this is I invite you to get a couple of small bowls or big ones, whatever you want, and place bowls of water in different rooms in your home as a symbolic way to stay hydrated and connected to the waters of life in this hot time. And this water will eventually evaporate into your space, and you can renew and refill those bowls and place them however, wherever feels good in your home. Just like in the winter season, it's so nice to light a candle or have a fire in the home. We can engage in that balance by bringing bowls of water, containers of water into our spaces to cool things down and to remind us that we can still go inward even though the sun is bright and hot and things are busy perhaps, or there's lots of people or trips or activities. We can bring these bowls in, these wells in to remind us to go inside once in a while, to tap into those deep, deep waters and be renewed. I hope you really enjoyed this episode this week and that it brought some refreshment to you and to your body. Next week, we're going to be exploring wild foods. So, the ways that people were fed by the land directly, and possibilities for how we might be fed in good ways by the land today, even in the midst of industrial agriculture and all of the stickiness that can come with the way we eat today. I want to look at how peasants fed themselves and what they fed themselves and what that relationship to food was like, and see if there are things we can pull forward to make our own experience richer this summer and beyond. Thank you for being with me today. Please let me know how this episode landed for you, and I'll see you next time. Until then, I hope you take such good care, and I'll see you on the other side.